I also have the distinctive pleasure of introducing our Karen Burke Memorial Lecturer. We have today Lanei Rodemeyer from Duquesne University. And Lanei, as you know, is a PhD candidate, PhD holder from Stony Brook. I have her dissertation here from 2001. And it was actually, the title then was Intersubjective Temporality, the Interface of Husserl's Temporal Ego and the Other. It's available in the graduate office. Lanei is an associate professor and director of graduate studies at Duquesne, and she works primarily, as you know, in Husserlian phenomenology and continental philosophy, philosophy of time, philosophy of the body, and feminist and gender studies. She's done extensive work on the phenomenology of time, not just her dissertation, but her well-known book on time that was published with Springer is called Intersubjective Temporality. It's about time, and she showed the intersubjective dimensions to temporality already in the lectures that concern time consciousness. This is without going into, although she was well familiar with all of the material in the C manuscripts and the material in the later 30s and the historical writings. She also introduced for us the important notion of intersubjectivity in time consciousness. Her second book is called Diaries of a Transsexual, Sullivan and the Body's Voice. That appeared with Springer in 2008. She was also the co-editor of a collection published in Continental Philosophy Review on feminist phenomenologies. That was with Sarah Hinema. It's an excellent edition, and we're very happy to have that contribution within Continental Philosophy Review. When she was at Stony Brook, she received several grants. One was the prestigious Day, also the grant from Belgium American Educational Foundation, and many other grants. Her articles concern, again, temporality, work on the body, and this latest work that she's been involved in concerns critique. And today she'll speak on this is part of her new book project, by the way, and we'll look forward to hearing that. Her title is, What Would Husserl Do? Applications of Classical Phenomenology. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lanei back to Stony Brook.
I realized about an hour ago as I was poking my head in here that the last time that I was in this room was when I defended my dissertation. So to have Tony pull out my dissertation, I'm like, oh my God, it really is true. It's just the dissertation all over again. I think the tables were arranged exactly like that. So I'm getting some flashbacks, but I've actually had a really wonderful time coming back. So I really want to thank the philosophy department here at Stony Brook for inviting me to give a talk here. I was very excited to receive the invitation, very excited to come back. So this talk is basically going to sort of span the work that I've done in the past. So Tony just talked about the books that I have written and some articles and things like that. And also, more importantly, where I'm sort of taking this. A little bit of what I'm doing now is circling back to that first book on inner time consciousness. So you'll see a little bit why. The title of the second book is different than the one you read. I think that was a proposed title. I really, really need to update my faculty page, obviously. So I'll mention that at the end. That's not important. Okay, so I want to start because I wrote on Husserl's inner time consciousness, which When I defended my dissertation, when I was working on publishing it, I presumed maybe 40 people on the globe would ever read, because not many people read Husserl, and when they do, they certainly don't go into his inner time consciousness stuff because it's really hard. So I'm going to start with some background concepts, just because I'm not going to presume that everyone in the room has read a bunch of Husserl's inner time consciousness stuff. The first couple of background is really super background, just in case you haven't done much Husserl at all. And that's the distinction between structure and content. Now, this is something I actually had to really become attuned to as I was working on my dissertation, because even Husserl's work on inner time consciousness and his own writings actually vacillates when he uses, say, the term retention or protension, vacillates between referring to the structure of inner time consciousness and the content. And so I realized sort of partway through the dissertation that I was vacillating, and that actually it was really important to pay attention to the distinction between the two of these. And this is partly due to what he's doing very early on, which is identifying essential structures. And he's looking for structures which are essentially there and basically what makes possible certain types of experience. So structure is, for Husserl, how consciousness is set up so that it constitutes experiences in the way we experience them. This, I would say, I was thinking about this, people sort of sometimes refer to him as going back to Plato. Other people refer to him with sort of a linkage to Kant. I would say this understanding of structure puts him more in the Kant direction, right? And then for him, then content is actually the experiences themselves, right? So if we're talking about example, inner time consciousness, the structure of inner time consciousness is that one of those essential structures, but you can also look at his discussion of noesis and noema, right? So the intentional structure of consciousness as a necessary structure, an essential structure. So even if you've read just a little bit of Ideas 1, and he's talking about noesis and noema, which of course he gets to very late in the book, you see that this relationship of consciousness being directed toward whatever is the content of its topic is in place regardless of the topic, right? And regardless of whatever we're thinking about, or regardless of what consciousness is doing, right? It doesn't matter if I'm remembering, it doesn't matter if I'm imagining, it doesn't matter if I'm hallucinating, right? There's still an activity of consciousness directed toward whatever is there. And this I find really productive in what Husserl offers, in the sense that we can have conversations about imaginary figures, right? Whereas in other philosophical approaches, if it's not real, then you can't really talk about it, right? But with phenomenology, I can talk about unicorns. You know what I'm talking about. We're both imagining, and we both have the same noema, right? Even if we're picturing them differently, right? So I have a black or chestnut colored unicorn. You might have a white unicorn. We're still talking about unicorns, and then we can work through the details if we want to. All right, so that's very basic. Did anything change? Nothing changed. There, okay. When we're talking about different approaches in phenomenology, so again, this is very basic. Tony and I both were working with static and genetic phenomenology. I made the mistake often early on, and this is something I'm becoming much more rigorous about now, is thinking about static approaches, and I would often blend that with sort of static types of content or texts that Husserl wrote, when actually I'm realizing that when Husserl's talking about static phenomenology, it's about a certain type of inquiry, a certain approach. So he's asking very specific questions. And the questions that he's asking when he's talking about static phenomenology, or when he's doing static phenomenology, is that search for essential structures, right? So he's looking for structures. He's not really caring so much about the content, or if he is caring about the content, it's because of how it's telling him about the structures, right? When you move to the genetic structure, the genetic approach, now we're looking at a very different type of inquiry. We're asking about how the content relates with itself, right, or with other contents, and how the contents relate to the structures. So the genetic questions are very different. So I realized this as sort of that first book was published, and I was talking about it because I realized I had always presumed that inner time consciousness was genetic, and realized actually that his early work on inner time consciousness is very, very static. So he's really just looking at form, right? And then there's then when you look at what he's doing later in the analyses of passive synthesis, he's still talking about time consciousness, but there's this one particular citation, which I think I did not put in this, and I'm sorry I didn't right now. There's one particular quote where he says, when we're talking about things like association and affectivity and things like that, even though they're temporally related, we're not talking about time consciousness because we're not talking about form anymore. We're not talking explicitly about form. And so the analyses of passive synthesis, I mean, the analyses of inner time consciousness, and this is what the citation says, analyses of inner time consciousness will not help us here because they're just about form. And when I'm talking about association, when I'm talking about affectivity, I'm not talking about just form. So I have to leave those analyses behind. I have to do new analysis. Okay, so I mentioned down here association and affectivity, and these are two things that I really had to dig into when I was writing the dissertation in the first book, partly because they are so connected to inner time consciousness, even if when you're pushing it past the structure. So I want to now define association and affectivity. Again, this is sort of the basic stuff. Okay, so association is the connection of different types of contents with one another. So Husserl read Hume. In fact, the most marked book of his in the Husserl archives in Leuven is Hume's. And now I'm blanking on the title, but it's like his inquiry, right? So Husserl's notion of impression, right, the primordial impression is obviously influenced by Hume. Hume talks about associations. And I think what Husserl offers to Hume's work is identifying the way consciousness works so that we have these associations in the first place. So Hume's the one who recognizes that we have association, that consciousness is the thing that does it, right? That connects causal relations, that connects similar things or connects things that are related by meaning. Husserl actually talks about how consciousness is set up so that we can do those associations, carry out those associations in the first place. Affectivity is another term which some have asked whether or not it's truly phenomenological. I think it actually is very phenomenological. It's how content calls to consciousness. So when something strikes me to notice it. And so there are different ways that consciousness can be called. There are really obvious ways, and there are less subtle ways. So I'm going to put up the examples here. So I'm going to start with the example for association. If you're in, say, an art gallery and you've got two bright red paintings and the rest of the room is white, right? You got a white couch, white walls, white floor, and the two bright red paintings, you're going to see them connected to each other in some way, even if they're across the wall, right? So you're going to see them as in some way associated with one another. Affectivity, and here's the different types of affectivity. And so it's interesting because Husserl kind of blends them together, but there's at least these three and possibly one more. So the first one is when you've got something really like brightly present, right? So something really bright in a room that's really drab, or he uses the example of a loud crash outside the window, right? Or a honking horn outside the window. So it makes you pay attention to it, right? So you can have it visually, you can have it orally, it could happen with sensation too. Like if you're tasting food and you're like, whoa, too much cumin, right? Something like that. Same thing, like it's calling to your attention, right? So this is one way where you have affectivity. The next is when you have two things that are very similar, right? So when I use the example of the two bright red paintings, affectivity is actually already in play there, right? Because the two bright red paintings are calling to you, and it's calling you to notice them together. So affectivity and association actually often work together. And if you're reading his analyses of passive synthesis, you'll see him talking about those terms together quite often. The last one is, and this is where you see him talking the most in the analyses of passive synthesis, is where you have a moment now that calls up a moment in the past. So this is where he's talking about affectivity in relation to recollection, and what I was calling, I called reproductive recollection. So they're really sort of a reproduction of the past in a very specific way. Now, the interesting thing, I use an example of like the smell of coffee reminds me of a Sunday morning when I was a child, but often the examples he's using is where I'm like, looking at something now that reminds me of something very similar from the past, right? So he's like, this will call up that past. But he also uses an example of, I'm having a conversation with a friend and I suddenly recall sitting on the beach during that one vacation when I was writing this other text, right? So he does acknowledge that affectivity is not always an association of similarity, but it may be an association of meaningful connections, right? Okay. So the reason that I'm pointing out or talking about association and affectivity is because I think, so this is my circling back now. Yes. Bathrooms, I think, are down the hall, and he's going to show you where the bathrooms are. My son, everyone. Okay, so circling back to association and affectivity, I'm circling back to sort of that first work that I did. And I realized while I was working on my dissertation that Husserl talks about association and affectivity in 3 different ways. And if you look at them carefully, and you're not paying attention, you wonder if he's contradicting himself, because he gives us one definition and then he gives another definition and it doesn't really jive with the first one, and then he gives another definition and that doesn't seem to jive. And so you ask yourself, why is he giving these very different definitions? And what I realize is that he's actually moving from one level of constitution to another, right? Now, he often doesn't announce it, right? So when you're reading the analyses of passive synthesis, you're going to just sort of read sort of paragraphs that flow into one another, but there are clue words along the way where he shifts from talking about one type of thing or asking a different type of question to another. And so I was identifying these 3, the 3 levels that I saw for association affectivity in the dissertation. Since then, I've actually realized that there are more levels moving upward in the level of intersubjectivity. So instead of intersubjectivity actually being only sort of one level of constitution for Husserl, I would argue there are at least 2. Thank you for doing that. So there are at least 2. So we're going to talk about those 2, and I'll talk about why I think there might be a third. It depends on how you want to look at it. So the other thing that association and affectivity do that I was already indicating is that when we're looking at association and affectivity, they beautifully demonstrate sort of this interconnection of structure and content. So they are definitely concepts that will come up at the through genetic analysis. You're not going to see them come up very well or very much in a static analysis. So if you're doing a static analysis of association, it's going to be very sort of stark and simple. It's going to get really interesting when you start doing it through a genetic analysis. So this is, let me pause here for just a moment and give you the example I like to give when I'm talking about the difference between a static analysis and a genetic analysis. So a static analysis would be, let's say we're going to take something really boring, like that Husserl does. You take a water bottle, right? All right, so we've got the water bottle. I'm doing a static analysis. Let me not put it here so that I have a water bottle in the recording. We've got the static analysis. I am perceiving the water bottle. So we have a structure of perception and content, right? Now let's say I put it down, I pick it up 100 times, right? And I turn it around 100 times, and I do this 100 times. And after 100 times of doing this, besides being really bored with my water bottle, I do this again. From a static analysis, the result is exactly the same, right? I am perceiving the water bottle, right? So we still have, from the static inquiry level, an act of perception and a content of perception. From the genetic inquiry level, though, the first example is going to look very different from the second example. So the first example is going to have perception of water bottle, possibly curiosity about this new object, right? A few other things, questioning about what its use is and things like that. After the 100th time, we're going to have added values, boredom, right? I'm sick of this water bottle. I picked it up 100 times, or now I'm really thirsty, right? So I really would like to drink instead of just pick it up, right? So there's going to be all sorts of different layers to the experience of the water bottle that are now part of my analysis in the genetic analysis that were not allowed or excluded in the static analysis. So static analysis doesn't let me think through the layerings of the experiences, whereas the genetic analysis wants to look through the layerings, right, and how they connect to one another. So that's sort of my example of how the inquiries are different for static and genetic, and how the outcomes can be different for static and genetic inquiries. The last thing that I wanted to point out is, and this is sort of like an indirect result of my fascination with association affectivity, is that the fact that they identify these 3 levels of constitution, which then sort of broadens out into more levels for me, indicates that there are a lot of applications of Husserl's phenomenology, well beyond the realm of Husserl's phenomenology. Now, part of this is my own project. I just think Husserl is, well, okay, on the one hand, Husserl is admittedly really hard to read. He's dense, he's plodding, right? He's not scintillating, right? And at the same time, he's got all of this material that is really fascinating for me, at least as a Husserl nerd, but also applicable in a lot of different ways. Now, this is just pointing to an article that has just come out recently, and Tony and I have talked about this because he was at the conference. The notion of Husserl as a classical phenomenologist has come out in recent articles that are supporting or sort of introducing critical phenomenology. And almost always in the articles that I've seen, Husserl is sort of set aside as incapable of doing critical work. So this is a personal pet peeve, right? You want me to go off, you got me behind a podium, this is dangerous, but I will withhold that argument. That's a completely separate argument. But part of my project is to simply demonstrate that what Husserl does is absolutely applicable, not to mention also critical, right? Stop laughing so hard. So part of, that's why I do want to apologize. The title of this talk was Classical Phenomenology, was a little bit snarky because of this sort of tension I feel with, not with the notion of critical phenomenology, because I actually think it's really cool and I do some of that work as myself. It's just that when you have this distinction between critical phenomenology and classical phenomenology, the implication is that classical phenomenology is not critical or not capable of doing critical work. And that's the issue I have, right? So it's just a terminological issue. It's not actually an issue about the projects. All right, so off the podium, back in front of the podium. Okay. So I wanted to look at a couple of citations, and unfortunately I did not put in the citation that I was referring to, but this is the citation that from Husserl's perspective, so like in Husserl's text, we see evidence of him working at levels, right? And if you talk to Husserl scholars, they talk about levels of constitution, but what I realize is that it's actually much more formally in place, even if he's not always mentioning the distinctions himself. So here he says, this is where he's actually formally saying. So he's talking about associations. He says, on the first level, which we addressed under the rubric of primordial association. So that's the term that I use for the lowest level of primordial of association, was that systematic or systematizing affective awakening that makes possible the object-like structure of the living present, all kinds of original syntheses proper to the formation of unity manifolds. And he says the second level was the awakening that radiates back. So actually he's talking about affectivity more, which illuminates once more the darkened empty presentations, bringing the contents of sense implicit in them affectively into relief. The third level is the level of the transition of such awakened empty presentations in reproductive intuitions. That means here rememberings. So the third level is where we see what I was calling reproductive associations, right? So this calling back of a very particular memory or something like that. Whereas the other two are distinct levels of affectivity and association. So I'm going to show a couple more quotes, and then I'm going to be working through these levels. I've been, selling them. I'm obviously going to walk you through them, but and I will point out where association and affectivity fall on each of these levels as well. Okay, so this is the connection of structure and content, which we see in the notion of affectivity. So another translation, he says affection, so affection, which is also affectivity, accompanies the connections, right? Only insofar as the conditions of materially relevant or figurative homogeneity are fulfilled, such that syntheses of coinciding can be formed in being adjoined or at a distance, can the affective framework exist, and can the affections propagate? Can the current affective force be augmented, et cetera? So he's basically saying, look, we need the content to connect, or we need the content to call to us before we can actually talk about or identify the structures. So this is, I think it's implicit through a lot of his analyses of passive synthesis, but this is a citation where it becomes really clear that he's saying, look, the content is essential here, essentially, right? In order for us to talk about these terms. All right. So applications, we're going to get to this at the end, but I just wanted to sort of point this out. This can be applied in a lot of different ways. I have written one article applying sort of these levels to the psychopathology of eating disorders. In the second book where I was working, I did some work looking at different levels of objectivity of gendered embodiment. So I've done some of this work already. The more I'm playing with this, the more I'm thinking, though, that instead of looking at this on every single level, I want to look at sort of this notion of intersectionality, because usually when we're talking about intersectionality, we still end up just sort of like listing the intersections of things that we, you know, the identities that a person may or may not experience. And it doesn't, this type of listing, right? So this acknowledgement that as a white female, I experience, say, gendered, I might experience gendered bias, but I still have privilege as a white person, right? And so my gendered bias is experienced very differently from a person who would be a Black woman in the United States, or a disabled woman, or something else, right? So these intersections don't just compound, they alter the types of experiences that one is having. And so while the literature out there touching on intersectionality, and this term has been around since I think the 1970s, but it's really sort of coming to the fore a lot now, I think it would be productive to have a sort of a phenomenological analysis of how these different identities in their intersections become phenomenologically different experiences, right? And so it's not just a listing of multiple things that literally intersect, but that they actually blend and bleed into one another in interesting ways. So that's some of the work that I have not done yet. All right, so the promised levels of constitution. And so this is going to be sort of the core of the book that I'm working on now. So the book that I'm working on now is going to start out by really working through that distinction between static and genetic phenomenology, and generative phenomenology will be included. It will also sort of work through sort of these notions of structure and content to some extent, but then it's going to really outline these levels of constitution. And then the second half, this is actually becoming a bigger half. It was originally going to be sort of just the last chapter, but the second half of the book is now going to be applications, like what we can do if we employ these levels of constitution that we see in Husserl. All right, so I'm going to refer to them as lower and higher. That's because that's how Husserl refers to them. However, I'm not trying to imply some type of hierarchy, right? I'm not trying to imply that there is that one is necessarily more important than the other. There is a building sense, right? But what I see as most important is the recognition that all of these levels, while you can take them up individually and do your analysis on any one of these levels themselves, they all in a sense feed into and bleed into one another, right? So whatever's happening at one level is going to influence the other levels as well. And that's the fun stuff that then you can do with, say, gender and psychopathology and things like that. All right, so the lowest level, and I'm calling it lowest because Husserl refers to it, is this low level of the primordial flow or the hyletic flow, right? Or he sometimes calls it the flow of material data, things like that. So when you're seeing references to data, when you see reference to primordial flow, or even the term primordial, those are clue words when you're reading Husserl, that he's working at this level, right? Now we see this actually already in Ideas 1, but he's referring to the highlight. There's a section or two on the highlight. The term that he uses, I'm not remembering the translation right now. It kind of covers it over, so you don't realize he's talking about the highlightic flow, but I think it's a weird translation of the term highlight that Husserl's using in the original. So it's already there as sort of the material basis for the noema in Ideas 1. It becomes much more of a topic in the analyses of passive synthesis, which is where I have a fascination with the highlightic flow, partly because it's so challenging from a phenomenological perspective, because on the one hand, it is a bit of a hypothetical suggestion, right? And on the other hand, Husserl does provide examples where he thinks he's identifying the highlightic flow. So the examples that I've seen have been in the analyses of passive synthesis. One easy example, he says, I've got a white piece of paper, I've got 3 red dots on it, right? And I'm going to constitute these 3 red dots together, right? They're not going to be constituted. The white paper basically is going to be in the background. I'm going to see the 3 dots in the foreground, right? And so I do that in a sense automatically, right? And so this is already happening. And so he's arguing that already at the level of the highlightic flow, so it's not just plain old like Humean flow. There's already what he calls primordial associations happening at this level, right? So consciousness is doing something, right? Or there's something happening in the relationship between consciousness and sort of the stimuli, if we want to use that word. I'm not sure if we want to use that word, that it's experiencing. There's already some kind of like relationship happening there, right? So these are called primordial associations. It's the really basic connections of similar colors with one another, similar sounds with one another, the distinction between color and sound, that they arrive in different ways. There's an interesting structural discussion that he has at this level too, where he's talking about time consciousness and how this notion of simultaneity and duration has to also happen at this level, right? The only way we have an experience of objects at all is if we have a continuity of the material colors or sounds or whatever that belong to them continuing through time, right? So if they are there for a split second and disappear, we don't have an object, right? They have to continue, and consciousness has to be at some level aware of their continuing, right? So there's sort of a formal and material discussion happening already at this level. All right, so the next level upward, I guess you call it, is passive synthesis. Now, it's interesting because passive synthesis has so much going on in it too. So there may be more levels than the ones I'm identifying here, right? So this is where we have the discussion of the layerings of experiences, right? And so in addition to having sort of this flowing of material data, we also have like a synthesizing of similar experiences with one another, right? So we see Husserl recognizing that when I experience one thing and then I experience it again, I don't have to go through active recall in order for them to be in a connection between the two of them. So this is, I would say, this notion of, I use the term far retention because he actually doesn't name it. He touches on it multiple times through analyses of passive synthesis, is this constitution of things that repeat. And he sometimes talks about it as an awakening of like memories, but it's not the same thing as an actual recall, right? And so he develops it somewhat. He points to, there's a small discussion where he's talking about the pounding of a hammer, and I'm not really remembering each pounding. I just know it as its own unity, right? And so that's what's sort of happening in passive synthesis, is sort of unifying things that are repeated or things that sort of build up on one another. Now, I think there's a lot more going on here than even Husserl talks about. I mean, this is language acquisition, right? This is corporeal habits, right? The fact, if I know how to dance, right? If I know how to ride a bike or anything like that, that's passive synthesis. I don't have to go through the recall of learning the English language or the definitions of specific terms or how I get on a bike or anything like that in order to carry them out, right? And so passive synthesis is is sort of that place where all this really essential stuff happens for human living, right? And it is the link to embodiment, I would say, although the highletic flow is obviously as well, because it's connected so much to sort of the sensory input. But here's where embodiment really comes into play, right? So if you're wanting to link Husserl to Merleau-Ponty, you take Merleau-Ponty's discussion of habits and you look at Husserl's discussion of passive synthesis, and you've got some really good stuff going on there. What's happening here also, and this is a difficult part of what Husserl is doing, is you have also that sort of formal layering of temporal experiences so that we can go back and identify when a recollection took place, right? So again, we're not always perfect at that, but we can say it happened a long time ago or it happened recently, but that also happens in passive synthesis because of this synthesizing activity. All right, so active constitution is what I'm calling it. This is the layer, or this is the level that most people who have read a little bit of Husserl are familiar with. So this is the level that you see in Ideas 1. This is the I am a subject constituting that object over there. So we see at this level, again, a lot's happening here. We have a much more concrete development of the sense of self. Sense of self is already happening at the level of passive synthesis, and even, well, we can argue about whether or not it's happening at the hyletic level, but it's definitely already being formulated in or synthesized at the level of passive synthesis. Here we can actually sort of constitute a thing called the self, right, or some kind of objective sense of self or subjective sense of self. We have objects now that are understood as not me, right? So we have a body that now has a sense of its own limits and how it experiences itself through touch, and that how when I pick up a thing, that thing does not feel me feeling it the way my hands feel each other feeling them. So this is different or other than the body, right? So we have that also happening at the level of active constitution. This is also where we have what I was referring to as the reproductive associations, where we have sort of constituted memories coming back into the present and being relived as memories. Quick note at the bottom, when you're doing work with Husserl, the notion of active and passive have a very different meaning than what you usually think of in philosophy in general. Active usually sounds very dynamic, passive sounds static, right, or very non-dynamic. But for Husserl, active actually means something that is in conscious awareness. So if it's active, it means I'm paying attention to it, or it's something that I can sort of point to as part of my conscious activity. Passive means something happening in the background of consciousness, right? So passive means it's happening as, if you want to use the Freudian term, I'm not sure, it'd be like some kind of subconscious activity, right? Something that's happening that sort of mechanically that consciousness is doing. So that's why the last level was passive synthesis. These associations are not usually actively carried out, right? It's not like I sit there and say, oh, I'm going to put that red painting and this other red painting, and I'm going to think of them together. No, they actually sort of come out to me, they jump out at me as sort of belonging to each other in some way or another. So that's why it's considered passive. All right, so we have, I'm arguing that there's at least 2 levels of intersubjectivity. So after you have the level of active constitution, where we have sort of this individual relationship with objects, we have the interpersonal intersubjective level. It is actually at this level where we have objects with the true sense of objectivity. So Husserl actually carries out really extensive arguments, and I don't know how many people know this, careful arguments about where we get the sense of objectivity in the first place. So, I mean, one of his major projects is sort of have conversations with the sciences, right? And with logic and things like that. So how can we have objects that that appear as not belonging to my own perception of them? It's only through my experience of other subjects. And so there's a couple of really cool, there's one especially, and I'm not remembering the section number right now, but in Ideas 2. I would argue that his work on intersubjectivity is much more extensive in Ideas 2, much more carefully carried out in Ideas 2 than it is in the fifth Cartesian meditation, which is where everyone goes to read about Husserl and intersubjectivity. But if you look at Ideas 2, you'll see much more careful analyses of what he's doing with intersubjectivity. So here on the interpersonal level, this is where he carries out sort of this careful argument that says, look, I cannot get a sense of an object, therefore, beyond myself, all by myself. I don't have the grounds within my own personal experience to do that. It only can happen when there are other subjects there that can actually sort of acknowledge that the objects are there for others as well. He also makes this really interesting argument. This is kind of on the side. This really interesting argument that says that I only have a sense of the reason that I need other subjects to know the objectivity of others is because my body isn't perfect. And my body fails me sometimes. And because it fails me sometimes, other subjects are what give me that notion of objectivity that is necessary. So a necessary objectivity can only come through other subjects, but I can get sort of a dependent notion of objectivity only through myself. And it's because bodies are not always giving me everything, right? I get blisters on my fingers, my eyes get blurry sometimes, things like that. And yet I know the objects are there, right? Okay, so this is the level where we have sort of I-thou relationships, right? Relationships between individuals or small groups, where we are constituting meanings together, where we are influencing each other in various ways. But it's a personal type of relationship with others. The second level of intersubjectivity, which I'm calling intersubjective community, is a much more general notion of intersubjectivity. So we see Husserl, and this is where I think there might be more than two levels of intersubjectivity. We see Husserl often, and this happens actually in the sections of Cartesian, the fifth Cartesian, where people stop reading. They read the first part where he has the person walking up to you and that type of thing, and then everyone stops reading. And then after that, he does all this cool stuff where you have where he's talking about intersubjective communities and histories and traditions and things like that. And there's a lot of this also in the manuscripts. But the two different ways, and they often happen sort of in the same breath where he talks about them, or in sort of paragraphs that follow one another. As you have him talking about communities as history, communities influencing one another, or he'll talk about different nations connecting to one another with different cultures and that type of thing. But he also talks about like this really abstract sense of intersubjectivity. So intersubjectivity as like a really abstract structure. So sometimes he's talking about sort of this content driven, different traditions, clashing, things like that. And sometimes it's just this notion of an intersubjective structure. So I've lumped them for now, both under this right now. Because they always sort of happen at the same time in his texts, right? So I think he's always sort of thinking beyond the interpersonal, and the beyond the interpersonal is, for him, it ends up sort of being both of these things. So I'm still trying to figure out how to sort of tease that out. But in some of the work that I've done, and this is more in the second book that I was doing, dealing with sort of gender, queer theory, trans studies, things like that, I've dealt with certain approaches that argue that discourse is the means to all meanings altogether, right? And all experience. So everything is always already discursive. And often the perception is that Husserl doesn't do that, right? So everyone understands Husserl at that sort of active constitution level, but Husserl's got this level already implicit. What I think is productive is that Husserl's got this level and all those other levels, right? And so you could talk, and I find the arguments of discourse being a major filter through which we have all of our experiences. I find that to be an extremely compelling argument. I also, though, think that there are occasionally experiences, especially sensory experiences, that rise up from embodiment in one way or another that haven't really been filtered through discursive filters. And so I see that as sort of a pushback against that position that sees discourse as being like the only way through which we gain all meaning. And so because Husserl has all of these levels, that's how I make that argument. That's how I find that sort of counter argument convincing. But this is where we get all sorts of different types of meanings that then affect how we think about things. So let's see, there we go. We got them all together now. And when I made the PowerPoint, I couldn't get this above the wooden floor, but then I realized that the highlightic level is already sort of below our sensory. So I thought, okay, it's appropriate, it should be there. But now I'm realizing it's a little hard to read because it's the colors. Anyway, so what I find really interesting is Husserl is often creating an argument or setting up an argument or offering a description on one of these levels, and then he'll shift to one or the other, often without announcing it. And that's where you'll see a shift in his definition or a shift in his approach. The clues for me have often been sort of very specific words. So you'll see the word primordial often when he's talking about there. You'll see passive or synthesis usually in this level. You'll see active often in this level. But you can do static or genetic analyses at any one of these levels, right? So you can do a static analysis within the level of passive synthesis. And in fact, you'll see in analyses of passive synthesis, entire paragraphs where he says, I'm doing a static analysis now, right? And then he does a static analysis, right? And then later he'll say, now I'm not doing a static analysis anymore. The interesting thing for me, though, is when we're looking at contemporary philosophy, it's essential to pay attention to the fact that each of these sort of feed into one another, right? So the argument about discourse still works, right? So discourse feeds all the way into how I sensorily experience my body, right? But at the same time, certain aspects of the sensory experience can also feed upward, which gives rise to discursive changes, right? And so the argument that I've often felt myself sort of pushing against is the argument that it only goes this way. And from a phenomenological perspective, it has to also go this way. Now, what I think is really useful is that sort of discourse theories give more of this emphasis, which I think Husserl has less of. Like Husserl needs this sort of counter position as well. So this is informative for Husserl, and this is informative for sort of the discourse theories, right? But I think all of them sort of intertwine into one another. And this is where I think that Husserl is he can give us an awful lot on the critical level, but also really applicable, right, to a lot of different areas. All right, so I think I'm within my realm. All right, so back to time. Sorry, I was checking the time. So we're back to this page. I'm going to touch on, since I don't remember when we started, 5 after. Is that right, Tony, when we started?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to touch on at least the psychopathology of eating disorders, because that's already published. And I think I'll talk a little bit about feminist gender. I have a page on race, but I think I might skip over that because I haven't really worked that one through as much. So if you're taking a psychopathology of eating disorder, so part of my focus is like, how would we want to not only explain it from a theoretical position, but also perhaps treat or therapeutically address an individual in an office who's seeking help. And the issue is, or the interesting thing is that you can talk about an eating disorder on all of these levels, right? Or on each of these levels. So you can talk about on the highest level, sort of attitudes about thinness and youth and relationships with food, all of which sort of feed into how we feel about our bodies, right? We can talk about on the next level down of intersubjectivity, specific discourses, right? High school girls teasing each other when, calling each other fat, things like that. Or you can talk about parents trying to create perfectionist children, things like that, right? At the level of active constitution, you can talk about how an individual constitutes their own body, right? How they constitute body types, right? Their presumptions about specific body types, the presumptions about how bodies should be, certain types of striving. At the level of passive synthesis, you're going to see habits that are developed, right? Habits that they may have lost, habits that they may develop. There's rituals with regard to eating, rituals with regard to food preparation amongst those who have eating disorders, rituals with regard to weighing. All of those are then, it may start out as an experience in active constitution, right? Where I decide to weigh myself. And, I'm not satisfied or something like that. And so then the next day I weigh myself again. And then before I know it, there's a certain habit that I've developed and possibly even a ritual that I weigh myself only at a specific time before I've eaten whatever meal and so many times a day or things like that. And that it may be accompanied with checking myself in the mirror, et cetera, et cetera. So these habits then become almost ritualized. And the last is the level of the hyletic flow, where we still have sort of primordial senses, but they can become covered over, right? So we can talk about where I may once have had pleasure in eating cake or something like that. Now I've developed a revulsion because it's got so much association with becoming fat or something like that, right? I might have originally experienced hunger, but I may have learned to not feel that, right? And so I've dulled that sense. So there are, again, these things are feeding into one another, and I am part of this, right? So my point is that, first of all, you can find articles dealing with each of these separately, and you can find therapeutic approaches looking at one or two or some of these. But my point in the article was that, first of all, recognizing I'm not a therapist, right? And so I'm not trained. So this is just a suggestion, but that a therapist who may want to enter and say, let's talk about how your family talked to you, right? Or let's talk about how your friends talked to you and how that might have affected you, should not forget the discursive level, the discursive context of the culture of that person, should not forget the habits that that person has developed, right? So that, of course, you can't do all of this at once in any specific therapy session, but to always keep the other levels in mind. So as you've worked through one, you can then sort of use that as a way to then work into another level and to enlighten yourself about another level, or to help you open up another level, right? So again, I don't know how effective a therapist would find this, but I would find that if I were in a session, right, a person who was dealing with only one level with me would only get so far with me, right? Because they haven't, if they only talk to me about my eating habits and they never address the fact that I'm living in a culture of thinness, then they haven't really helped me with all of the issues that are in play, right? Now, this is not going to work with every psychopathology. Eating disorders is particularly fruitful because it does work on so many levels, but I'm sure that it's not the only psychopathology that works on so many levels, right? So I'm in communication with people who do phenomenology and psychopathology about how we can apply this to other levels as well. All right, so another place that I've looked at this is looking at gender. And this is in the book on Lou Sullivan's Diaries, which is a very different type of work. It actually is 3 chapters of unpublished diaries, which are now published in this book. And 3 chapters really just working through sort of discourse theories about gender, right? And so it's looking at queer theory, it's looking at trans studies and actually the tensions between queer theory and trans studies. And in the last chapter, I introduced phenomenology and a couple of sections of Husserl's analyses in Ideas 2. So I'm not saying, okay, here's Husserl 101. I'm saying, look at these, just these 10 pages or so, where Husserl talks about how the body is sort of phenomenologically mine at one level, and then it becomes very different for me when I am in an intersubjective relationship. So he actually talks about how I have a body, right? And I sense this body, and this body is constituted in a certain way, but there's a completely new layer when this body enters into the intersubjective realm. And so I use that argument to sort of speak to discourse theorists, right, or the queer theorists, to say, look, there are different levels at which we're dealing with embodiment always, right? And I was addressing sort of trans studies and saying, trans studies has done a lot of pushback against queer theory and also against the medical community. Perhaps this sort of terminology of having multiple ways that we can understand objectivity would be useful in understanding gender, right? So there's not just objective and subjective, there's actually layers to objectivity, right? And we could even talk about layers to subjectivity. And so this again would follow a similar pattern, right? So we're talking about sort of the discourses about gender, right? Presumptions of a gender binary, right? Some type of alignment that presumes an embodiment that connects with a sexual orientation, that connects with a gender identity, et cetera. And this connects into media representations and its own type of logic, right? The sort of binary logic or the binary gender logic, right? At the next level down, of course, you have how people are talking about my body with me, how I'm talking about my body with others, how I relate to others with this embodiment, and how I believe this embodiment or how I feel this embodiment, right? This is also where we have the objective body. So I tacked that on in there. And then at the lower levels, we have sort of how I experience my own body. Sullivan was a trans man who was also gay. So he transitioned to become a man to be with men. And so he was experiencing his embodiment in a way that from the outside, nobody saw an issue, right? He was in a relationship with a man and everyone thought it was normal because he was what everyone saw to be a woman, right? And so everyone's like, what's the problem? You're getting what you want, right? You're sleeping with men, no big deal. And for him, it was this absolute struggle, right? So the problem wasn't at the discursive level. The problem was with this disconnect between embodiment and the discursive level, right? And so then this allows us to have a sense of, or to be able to describe what someone might be feeling or sensing that is not necessarily described in the cultural language already, right? And he was trying on language literally, like he was trying to figure out how to describe how he felt, right? And so he tried describing himself as bisexual. He tried describing himself as a transvestite, right, for a little while. So these terms he was using. And so, but he, in his diaries, he's literally describing sort of the same type of thing, right? I feel like I'm a homosexual man. And so those types of things are going to come down at this lower level. And we see both the necessity for the discursive, at the same time we show this sort of embodied disconnect from the discursive. And so that's what that book on Sullivan was about. And that's why I find, again, these layers useful for articulating these types of disconnects. All right, so this is the critical theories of race. Again, this is not an area in which I have entered very carefully, but I see that this could also be useful or might be useful because we have, again, sort of this distinction between what's happening in the discursive world, institutional biases, policies, things like that, and then interpersonal experiences, right, which have different impacts, whether or not they all end up having negative impacts on a person who's experiencing them. But there's a difference between the interpersonal and then the institutional, right? And then also how an individual deals with that, right? How an individual lives through that and how they constitute their own bodies, whether they're experiencing their own bodies from a privileged position or from a position that is experiencing implicit bias. And then the habits of constitution that everyone in a society would have, right? Both at an individual level and in as groups, right? And then the primordial level is sort of those lowest levels of experiences of embodiment as sensation, but also attractions to different people and things like that. And I put that in there partly because I was on a dissertation committee of someone who was doing an analysis of attractions through a racial lens, right? To recognizing how people may be attracted to the other, right? As a white person being attracted to a person who's Black, or being not attracted to someone who identified as other, and how basically what we think to be sort of from in a Foucauldian sense, the sort of the most raw type of sensory is actually not, right? So doing that kind of Foucauldian analysis. All right, so there's lots of other applications. The one person pointed out to me that I hadn't really talked about. My ultimate goal is that using these levels is a way to be able to bring out change, right? Whether it's an individual change, right? Someone in the therapist's office who can now feel better about themselves, or institutional changes, right? So all levels of changes as well. And that's what I'm hoping that providing sort of an understanding, but also terminology can offer, right? So saying that, I will say thank you. And there's the correct title of the book. Thank you for opening. It's getting warm in here.
Thank you for the extremely clear, detailed, insightful, creative presentation.
Thank you.
It's really something that very few people can do as you've doing it so well. Thank you. That's great.
As a Stony Brook graduate, right?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah,
You know, I
okay.
didn't want to about that. I've been saying it the whole time, but if you want to go to the source, okay. And we have lots of time for questions.
Charlie.
Yeah. Maybe lots of questions, but I'll try to limit it. So I'm very interested in the stuff on affection, and I've worked on that topic of affective awakening, the passive synthesis lectures.
Fun stuff.
But I think I'll ask a question just more generally. So you have the different layers of constitution that you were laying out. And then,
Do you want me to go back to that?
sure.
There.
Okay, and then the floor, right? And then I'm more familiar with that distinction between a static and a genetic and a generative analysis. And I guess the way I understand those distinctions is that Husserl is moving from more abstract to more concrete experiences or ways of describing experience, and that even if the more concrete levels are founded in some sense on the more abstract, that he's trying to deepen and get to a level of something that's more concrete. So I guess my first question is, how would you sit, if you agree with that, how do these levels here, do you think do they map onto the static genetic generative distinction? And if they do, or if they don't, what is the relationship? What's governing the relationship between the levels? Is it a relation of a founded? Is it an abstract to concrete, or concrete to abstract? I'm trying to understand the relationship that's maybe authorizing a move from one level to another level.
Okay, all right. So let me answer the first question. I don't think that you can say that. Okay, so I argue against mapping like generative up here, static here, and so I argue against that, partly because I realized, like, I was reading analyses of passive synthesis, and I'm like, well, this is all genetic, right? And then he's sitting there saying, this is a static analysis, and I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? Why? And I realized that I had made the mistake often in my own work to think that you could map sort of like, I'm doing static analysis because I'm doing this level and I'm reading this text, right? And I'm doing so that it has to be genetic if I'm doing this, it has to be static if I'm doing this, it has to be generative if I'm doing this. And what I realized was that it's actually that while there is overlap, right? Often we see generative work doing here, often we see static here, often we see genetic here, that it's actually about the type of question being asked. Right. And so when I'm analyzing structure, right, when I'm really sort of looking at structure and I've sort of bracketed out content, then I'm doing static, and I can do that up here, right? I can do that when I can do static analyses of intersubjectivity when I'm really just looking at transcendental forms, right, of intersubjectivity. So if he's doing a transcendental formal analysis of intersubjectivity, that's a static analysis, right? When I could be just looking at, like, so the example of the bottle, right? I can do this at the static, but I can also just look at the bottle in a genetic way, right? If I'm talking about the layers of experiences, right? And I can do static analyses of time, which I realized halfway through my dissertation, that's what I'm doing. It's not genetic, it's actually static, right? Because he's doing formal work. So that's that's how I realized that even though I'd been making this mistake and talking about sort of static levels, so you'll see in secondary work, even mine, right? Static levels, genetic levels, and generative levels. I think that's a mistake that I was making. I think others were making as well. They're actually static approach or static inquiry, genetic inquiry, genetic approach, and generative inquiry and approach, right? Or method, you could say, a genetic method, right? And that these are levels of types of experiences, right? So the way that, so now to your second question, how do we sort of see these as related to one another? So I'll give you an example, but I'm not sure if it quite answers your question. All right. So I'm thinking of, like, I watch a lot of Marvel movies nowadays for obvious reasons. I'm thinking of like a sort of comic book movie motif where you start out at like an atomic or cellular level. So the image on the screen is like cells, right? Blood cells floating around or something like that. And then you pan out, right? And you see, say, a skeletal structure. And then you pan out again, you see a body, right? And you pan out again and you see the body on a street, right? Or on a neighborhood. You pan out again, you see the whole city. Pan out again, you see, of course, the globe. Okay, so that's kind of like, it's all there all the time, right? So all of these are always there. It's just, what are we looking at, right? Are we looking at the cellular level? Then we're down here. Are we looking at the city or the globe? Then we're up here, right? And have we refocused the lens to look at sort of like the body itself? Then we're here. So it's all happening at the same time. So I'm not sure if that answers your foundation question, because they're not necessarily founded on one another. They're all, in a sense, happening all at the same time, if that makes sense. So,
I don't think more about that.
yeah.
Because I mean, you can't have a body if it's not made up of cells, but then you can't have cells unless there's oxygen.
Right,
other
right.
things
Which
happening.
is why I think it works, because you need to have sort of the globe in order to have the cells, right? And right. So
Yeah, closely related to Charlie's question, isn't there a difference between the two last levels and everything above it? And here I'm looking at this as Bergson might, that force, durée, materiality in the expanded sense that Derrida and Husserl give are more fully represented in those first two levels than the upper three, so that the apparent democracy of levels of constitution might be subject to not critique, just pointing out a very important differentiation, that the generation of meaning, sometimes just called force or durée by Bergson, is essentially located at the two bottom levels, and nothing would happen at the upper levels without that, whereas the reverse is not true. So we have a sine qua non, a status of those first two levels. So how would you answer that? I'm not saying that, I agree. I'm saying that would be a Bergsonian.
right, you're throwing me a serious curveball here, Ed.
reading. Yeah.
Okay, so so Husserl would agree with you, right? I think Husserl is very much of there is indication, sometimes quite strong indication, that this really is the ground floor, right? And without the ground floor, we don't go anywhere else. I am living in this world where we have discourse theory that has argued that this is the ground floor, right? And there's nothing else there. So I'm trying to find like this middle space where I think they go back and forth. Now, what I would say is that when you're talking about something like materiality, right? We have at this level we have this notion of sensory data, right? Which is one aspect of, so the notion of matter changes. Let me put it this way. The notion of matter in a phenomenological sense changes, right? So here we have flowing material sensory input. Here we have that still happening, but now we have it as layers of meanings, right? Now we have a meaning called matter, right? You know, like I am now experiencing objects. And here we have an objective constituted definition of matter that now becomes like a scientific concept, right? Especially up here. So they're all matter, right? And so this is, so in sort of the discourse arguments, they basically say, look, matter is a constituted term that we made up along the way, right? We can point to different moments in certain sociology things where the notion of matter became a thing that scientists started to talk about, and then we began to think of it as real. And the implication is that it's not real because it sort of appeared in discourses. And that's the argument for ignoring these lower levels, right? And so the phenomenologist says, no, this is the ground level, right? But my point is, this is a really convincing argument too, right? But it doesn't come from nowhere, right? So the phenomenological, my position is the phenomenological counter position, especially into sort of today's philosophy, is to say, yes, you're right, matter as a concept did appear, and we can talk about where it did and when scientists started using it and how people started taking that up and started thinking of it in a specific way. But they never would have done it if we didn't have this, right? And so we've got this, and especially if we're looking at discursive changes, right? So that's why I was looking at trans studies and sort of changes of language about trans studies, because we have very specific literature. There are arguments in queer theory that say transgender is a created concept by the medical community. The trans community has actually argued very strongly against this, right? And And the interesting thing is, if you look at the debates in the sort of 1990s or early 2000s, the trans community is pointing to materiality as they're talking about the materiality of their experiences, the materiality of their embodiment. And so the discursive theory counter was, well, we already know matter is a constituted comment. So you're just proving our point, right? And so this is where I sort of say, look, I'm not trans. Like, I recognize I'm not trying to undermine any argument that or descriptions that trans people are making, but perhaps phenomenology can help by introducing the fact that we have the live, right? We have the embodied experiences, which is a third position, not just the discursive and not just this notion of the empirical, right? The empirical material versus the discursive or the ideal, but there's this third position, which is the sensory embodiment position. And that position actually can negotiate some of the aporias that we've been seeing in the sort of battle that was happening in the 1990s. But I think I went far afield of your question. So did I address it at least to some extent?
Yeah, no, that's helpful, right? And I think the conversation would need to continue, but nevertheless, I think you're onto something really quite. You're showing us the complexity of the model itself.
Yeah.
And the subtlety, which is what I think a good model should lead us to.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mosin?
Yes. My question is about the relation between method and matter. Your way of explaining different levels of constitution and different approaches of analysis looks to me more like a research method that is ignoring the way the phenomena and the way that the phenomena is given and its impact on the method. You know,
yeah.
This dynamism between method and matter, and how certain phenomena calls for a certain method of analysis.
I think
also whether there are some phenomena that do not fit in these 5 categories, like maybe emotions. Some of the emotions are not really passive, not active.
Right.
So is it like an encompassing, like exhaustive, kind of distinction that you have made?
No, I think that there could be more here, right? So to answer your last question, I'm not going to claim that this is exhaustive, because I think I was even saying I think there are more levels already here. I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that some phenomena call for a certain type of analysis, and I would completely agree. And I think that's why there was a tendency to call sort of, even in my past work, sort of certain contents generative, certain contents genetic, and certain contents static. But I think it's a mistake to think that some content like that, there's a group called static contents and that's all that there is, and a group called genetic, and there's a group called, because I think that there are things that can be treated by all 3. So I would say intersubjective work does call for generative analysis more than others, but you certainly can do a static analysis of intersubjective forms, right? Or transcendental forms at the intersubjective level. But yeah, there are definitely, like even I was saying, associations and affectivity, it's really hard to do a static analysis of them, right? In fact, the quotation that I gave from Husserl indicates that he's saying we can't. And then there's the other quotation that I referred to that I didn't put in here, and I wish I had, because now I've referred to it 3 times. And where he specifically says we can't use the analyses of inner time consciousness here, because that's about form, right? And so that means he's basically saying when we're talking about association affectivity, static analysis is almost impossible, right? I would say we could attempt and maybe just talk about a little bit about how they work structurally, but then we stop, right? And I've also argued myself that a lot of things you'll do a static analysis of, and then you hit sort of this limit where you're asking further questions, and then you're sort of forced into the genetic, right? Because the content, right? The object itself pushes you to ask the next questions, and that will push you to the next level. So yes, there's definitely, I think you're right. I need to make sure that I bring that other side too, that the phenomena also calls for certain approaches. And it also calls for being at specific levels as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Hi, he was just at Duquesne. I wasn't there. I had to watch from from at home on my computer. So I got to see your talk from, I got to see it virtually. So I'm sorry I wasn't there.
I don't think they set it up for well that you managed to hear most of it?
Yes, I did hear it very well. It was also because of the child that I was not there in person, so I'm sorry for that.
Anyway, how much of this applies to animals? Is this exclusively a study of human consciousness or brought clear on animal life?
Okay, so I take it back. Ed did not throw me the curveball. You just did. Okay, so Husserl, compared to a lot of other philosophers, is actually somewhat open to discussing animals and animal consciousness. So Dieter Lohmar has done quite a bit on this. I have not spent a lot of time with Dieter Lohmar's work. He actually recognizes that there are also that a lot of the stuff that he does at this level is talking about sort of a mature adult consciousness doing specific things, right? So even child consciousness or infant consciousness is not doing these things yet, but they can. So I would say that if we're doing analyses of animals, we probably could talk about these levels depending on the animal and depending on how well we can sort of glean from their behaviors, where they're functioning. But I know that there are species of monkeys that definitely work on these levels. I mean, they have hierarchies and castes and all sorts of things, right? And actually, I argued against someone who was at a completely different talk, and he was basically saying animals they don't have, and don't have consciousness, they don't, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, and I referred to elephants like grieving when they lose one of their tribe, right? So obviously, I would say animals definitely have this. They certainly have this. They definitely have association. I would say sometimes we could talk about animals or mammals for sure, work with association, possibly even more than they do with what we would call sort of recollected memory, but they function on association very regularly. Like, so they associate certain stimuli with pain or pleasure, and then they survive that way, right? So I think association actually functions even more at a deeper level for us than active recall. So yes, I think animals work. We would not give the exact same description to an animal that we would to a human, but I would say that they probably, many of them, and I realize most of my examples are mammals, right? So I'm not sure about other species. Birds have really high cognitive abilities too. So I would, and also like group dynamics and things like that. So you're testing my animal knowledge at this point. But so the short answer is yes, I think it would. It might push to add more layers in there that I haven't recognized, or to add dimensions within these layers that I haven't been able to describe yet.
Just on that, actually, there's several passages where Husserl will speak about the co-constitution of what he calls a homeworld. One of my other questions, but I want to. Between animals other than human and human animals constituting a homeworld. And where he makes another distinction would be along the lines actually of normality and abnormality again, whether it makes sense to compare one species to another because of what is optimal in one species and what is another. This is actually a claim that Chomsky makes about trying to compare apes to humans as pre-linguistic, which doesn't do justice to them. So it's a matter of certain senses or certain meanings, or within a broader homeworld, or within a certain normality.
Yeah, this isn't a curveball. This is just something I didn't quite hear right, which is at a certain point you talked about objectivity, the presentation of things to us that in such a way that we don't belong to them. And you mentioned the phrase levels of objectivity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So for Husserl, there's at least two levels of understanding objects as objective, right? I think in the translation of ideas too, you have objective with a small o and a big O, but I'm not sure if the translator followed that carefully either. So the level of the small o objective, that's what we'll just call it now, whether or not it's actually in translation. So the level of small o objectivity is my experience of embodiment and recognizing that in perceptual experience, my experience of my own body, especially on the basis of touch. So he understands touch to be sort of the major way that I experience my own body, is sort of this double sensation. So when I touch my own body, I feel myself being touched, right? And then he says, sort of at this really rudimentary level, there's this recognition that when I touch other things, I don't have that sense of feeling myself being touched, right? So I have things that I touch where I feel it, right? So my arm feels it and my fingers feel it. And then I pick up this and my fingers feel touching this, but there's not that second level, right? There's not that other half of the sensation. So that's where he says we get this basic level of small o objectivity, where I recognize that there are objects that are not my body, right? They're other bodies, right? They're other things. Then when we get to the intersubjective level, and I think he sees it already at the interpersonal intersubjective level, then I can understand objects to be sort of there for everyone is the word he uses, right? So he calls them there for everyone, or objects. Basically, it's big O objectivity. So objects that are object permanent that exist regardless of where I am and regardless of whether I exist, right? But he says that level of objectivity can only arise when I have an experience of other subjects as well, in some way or another. Does that yeah, okay.
So I think, interestingly, a number of these questions bring up the question of maybe a general difference between classical, in the sense of versus critical, Husserlian transcendental phenomenology, which is about like active constitution in consciousness, right? It's like phenomenology of consciousness, which is classical phenomenology, versus, for example, I mean, and maybe this is just like a general distinction in ways of doing phenomenology, which is ultimately the same sort of thing, but versus like ontological phenomenology. And you see both of them, for instance, in Edith Stein, but there's the big early phenomenological schism between the transcendental and ontological. But like when you bring up touch, for instance, and you mention this double constitution, right? You see this also at the core of the inner time consciousness, right? There's this double constitution, and the two levels that are intersecting there are immanent time, immanent inner time consciousness, and objective time. So there is also some objectivity in the sense of maybe hyletic in the sense of consciousness transcendental phenomenology, but there's also that ontologically objective sense as well. And so I just think that like everything you're doing can also be brought into ontological phenomenology, where also the genetic versus static distinction is there in the like potentiality versus actualization of like metaphysics in general, right? And Husserl's like later work in metaphysics or reconstructive phenomenology, like in Husserlian 42, where he talks about the hule and the entelechia and all that metaphysical stuff again, right? So I'm just thinking like this can apply equally to an argument for bringing classical Husserlian phenomenology to meshment more with critical phenomenological general methods and practices, as well ontological phenomenological stuff.
Cool, you're on my team. So yeah, no, actually, I think it's really interesting that I didn't hear a question, so I'm just going to make a couple comments on what you were saying. Was there a question?
Oh no, I think maybe the very general question
Whether I think
that is begged is like transcendental, i.e. classical phenomenology, which you're outlining all these levels of constitution of, you know, how might that compare with ontological phenomenology? Got it.
Okay. All right. So, so one small point of interest in his early work, Husserl is dealing with sort of the immanent notion of temporality, and then this question of the objective notion of temporality. He ends up deciding he can't deal with the objective, right? So he ends up bracketing it out, and that ends up being around the moment where he introduces this notion of absolute consciousness, because that's the only way he can resolve sort of the time problems. And then absolute consciousness then goes into ideas one and becomes the basis for active constitution, right? So, but he can only do that when he sort of sets aside the objective for a while at least, and then he can return to it later. But he was, this is just my fascination with the philosophy of time in general. He hit the same aporia that almost everyone in the philosophy of time hits when they try to understand time, both through my experience of time and as an objective entity, right? And when you do that, you make claims like there is no time and things like that, right? Or time is impossible. You hit these absolute aporia. So he shifted to sort of describing subjective time. So I would say I want to think more about what you're saying with regard to sort of transcendental phenomenology and ontological phenomenology, only because I see the notion of ontology being used in a lot of different ways, right? So one being Husserl's understanding of regional ontologies, right? Which I find quite useful, but that's mostly at the level of active constitution. It's just sort of groups of, you have ideal meanings. So the mathematical world is a regional ontology. The material world is as a sensory experience is another regional ontology. We've got a few others. And the mains are the mathematical and the sort of experiential, at least in ideas one. So those are regional ontologies. Then you've got Heidegger, who's talking about ontology with a capital O practically, right? And he's really trying to figure out what being is altogether, which is not at all sort of a claim about materiality, but really a claim about our experiences with the world. So the world is implicitly always already there. So now we have yet another understanding of materiality, right? And then we have, I'm not going to say necessarily analytic, but we have other sort of philosophical approaches that use the notion of ontology to refer to the material world, right? And so I would have to think through which ontological phenomenology this would work with. But I think you're right in the sense that it's trying to address a lot of these distinctions by recognizing that we're often talking at cross purposes and not necessarily disagreeing when we're doing sort of these different aspects of phenomenology. There was something else I was going to say, but now I forgot what it was. I'll think about it. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good insight, but it's still something that I need to think about. Something about Merleau Motif, I forgot.
I mean, I had in mind Hedwig Conrad Martius in particular, but I mean, Heidegger, like,
yeah.
That works. But I was also thinking of like the objectivity and the different levels of constitution and maybe like the two kinds of objectivity.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I saw he talks about levels of matter and materiality as well around the same section in Ideas 2, where he's talking about different levels, and he doesn't call them different levels of objectivity. He just sort of says we're now shifting to like as soon as we enter the intersubjective world, we have a whole new meaning. And I can't remember the exact site. I've referred to it multiple times, but I'm not remembering the exact citation. But it's like basically the objective eyes of others folds back on myself, right? And I have a whole new view of myself in that moment. And so this is the sort of layers of actually even self-understanding that I think. But I'm still trying to remember the last thing I was going to say, but I think it was a small point. So if I remember, I'll let you know.
Elena?
Is there time for one more?
Yes, please. Yeah, we have time for one question.
I was intrigued when you unfortunately very, very quickly mentioned something that instead is for me central. And that is when you showed the PowerPoint first, I think, with the listing the passive constitution, and then immediately after the active constitution steps or so. And then you said something like, well, the sense of self is, you know exactly. Okay, so I don't need to explain it. The sense of self, I would like to know, is it presupposed by either the passive or the active or both constitutions, or is it engendered by them?
So I would say that, so I think there are levels to the self as well. So I think that the self has different aspects to it. So at the very primordial level, Husserl will probably say that all of this sensory flow, in a sense, it's channeled through one perspective, right? Which is this body's perspective. So I don't have a sense of self at that level, because there really isn't an I or a self, but there still is this grounds for an I or a self already at the primordial level, because it's all sort of channeled through this certain perspective. At the passive level of passive synthesis, and I'm pretty sure that I saw an analysis of this, but right now I'm not able to visualize where it was, but I believe it was in the analysis of passive synthesis. Just where in the analysis of passive synthesis, I'm not sure. He talks about how, might have been in ideas too, sorry. He talks about how the continued experiences, sensory experiences of this body form sort of my feeling of this body itself, which then sort of is the grounds for an embodied self, right? But I think it's only at the level of active constitution where I say, I am a self, right? Like, so this concept of self can only start here. And I would say it's really only developed here, right? Because the notion of self in comparison to another self really can only happen at the level of interpersonal constitution. So the short answer is, I believe it's engendered. It's not presupposed. Though possibly if he's doing a static analysis, then it's going to look presupposed, right? Because he's going to talk about sort of the formal structure of a transcendental ego, which I think is why he got so much flack, right? Because he's setting out this, he's basically stating a transcendental ego and then doing the static analysis. But when he goes into the genetic analysis, then you see that the formal structure, the formal structure only is made possible through these experiences in a certain way, right?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I like that question. Thank you. Yeah, I did fly through that.
Yes, I know.
So, thank you very much, Lanei.
Thanks for fantastic questions.
Setting up dinner next door, almost next door, in the library. So it should be, that's what the roller cart was doing. So we can take a quick break, and then we'll be going down a couple of minutes.
What about the cheese ball?
Oh,
Oh,
right.
have some cheese balls.
The cheese balls.
I'll move my stuff.
Right, thank you. Alyssa is a famous cheese ball that she made for us. Yeah, thanks.
Well, then I have to have some. Thank you all for your fantastic questions as well.